So I want to take a few minutes to talk about this moment where Yosef and Binyamin, it says that, because remember, Yosef and Binyamin, Yosef had 11 brothers, but 10 of them were half-brothers. They were all paternal brothers. He only had one brother who was a complete paternal and maternal brother, and that was Binyamin. So Yosef and Binyamin embrace, and it says that the way it's worded is, it says that Yosef fell on Binyamin's neck and cried, and Binyamin cried on Yosef's neck. Now we could just read that and keep going, and it's like, yeah, well, when two people embrace, that's kind of, how the cookie crumbles. That's what it looks like. But the Torah also didn't have to be that specific, right? Every time something happens, it doesn't describe the anatomical associations between the two people every time they encounter each other, and this one was up to there, and this one was up to there, and he was up, there's a lot of detail here that's not necessary. It could have just said, and they embraced each other and cried. It doesn't say that. It says, and Yosef embraced Binyamin and cried on his neck, and Binyamin cried on the neck of Yosef. There's obviously something here that it's telling us in addition to the fact that they embraced each other and cried, because otherwise it would just say they embraced each other and cried. So there are a few things here that, first of all, there's the separation of telling us each one individually. It could have said, and Yosef and Binyamin embraced each other and they cried. It says Yosef embraced Binyamin and cried. Binyamin cried on Yosef's neck. And there's the neck, the mention of the neck. So if we take a moment, there's a message here that is discussed in Midrashim. If we think about the function of the neck, right? The neck is extremely important, while at the same time it doesn't actually do anything. What does the neck do?
Support the head. So point of connection.
Yes, exactly. The neck, we can't write with it, we can't walk with it, we can't think with it, we can't eat with it. It doesn't have any active role. It doesn't do anything. At the same time, the neck is the point of communication and transition between the head and the brain and the entire body. The whole world gets its godliness and divinity through the Beis HaMikdash. It's like a portal through which godliness can fill the whole world. So the Beis HaMikdash is like the neck, this point of communication, of travel between the head and the body, between God and the world. Between Yosef and Binyamin, both of their portions in Israel had, let's say, a temple in them. Yosef put his head on Binyamin's neck and cried. The Midrash says Yosef cried about the destruction of the temple in Binyamin's portion of Israel, and Binyamin cried in mourning the destruction of the temple in advance that was going to be built in Yosef's portion in Israel. So each one was crying about the destruction of the temple in the other one's portion. So they put their heads on each other's necks and cried. Okay, so now we understand what it means. But there's still got to be more here. Why? First of all, why did Yosef cry about the destruction in Binyamin's portion and not about his own? Binyamin cried about the destruction in Yosef's portion and not about his own. Why? And ultimately still, why is that sufficiently important for us to know that the Torah had to put in all these extra words just to let us know? There are lots of interesting things that the Torah does. I'm sure a lot of interesting things happened. There were lots of interesting subtexts and, things between the lines and all of these things that were happening in every incident in the Torah. It doesn't tell us about every single one. Obviously, if the Torah spends all of these extra words to say this in a way that's a little bit not super smooth, it's not concise, a little bit maybe even cumbersome, there has to be a reason, there has to be value in it. It's not just to give us an interesting piece of information. The word Torah actually comes from or is related to the word hora'ah, which means instruction. Torah is to a degree a history book of sorts, but that's not its identity or function. That's incidental. Torah is hora'ah. Torah is a book of instruction. If the Torah adds in words and says all of these details, there's an instruction in there for us. What's that instruction? Yosef and Binyamin, who loved each other very much, each foresaw, whether consciously or subconsciously, a big loss that their brother, that the other one was going to experience and suffer, and cried about it. They cried about the loss of their brother where they didn't cry about their own loss. And there's a message here that's extreme. I mean, there are a number of pieces and angles here, each of which we could talk about for hours. And as you probably already know, I would easily be able to talk about them for hours, except that we have a limit on the time we can spend. So, really a big part of understanding the message, the instruction that the Torah is giving us here, is to talk about and to understand and relate to the function of crying. Now, crying has a number of functions. Primarily, crying is a way of expressing grief, expressing pain, and expressing. The word express literally means to take something that's inside of us and present it outward. And that's a very, very extremely important part of processing grief and pain, so that it doesn't end up stuck inside in a way that it's not supposed to be and just cause all sorts of unnecessary additional pain and suffering and damage. It's very important. The question is, just trying to think about how to put this clearly. Not clearly, but without overcomplicating it unnecessarily. There can be, if you talk about how valuable something is, you could talk about the absolute value, you could talk about the relative value, and they could be two very, very, very different things. Right? A $100 bill is worth $100. The relative value of a $100 bill to a homeless person on the street is extremely different to the relative value of that $100 bill to Elon Musk. Same absolute value, but the relative value is very different.
Just thought of like the Rabbi's dollar as a good example.
Yeah. I mean, there's an additional separate value. But yes, absolutely. Well, those could be worth a lot more than $1.
I was going to say, this is a side question, but where did he get all these dollars from? Was there like a bank on Crown Heights that he went to? Or no, not like a...
I mean, there were people who sponsored them. And I mean, there were times when in the middle, more people showed up than were expected, and someone had to run off and go get hold of like all these extra $100 bills. It's a real thing, yeah. We take things for granted and sometimes don't think about the real details of making things happen. But yeah. So, the same thing that's true of value can be true of importance. So the importance or priority of something can have, let's say, the same importance in two different contexts, but in one context, the relative importance is much higher. In its second context, the relative importance is much lower, because in that second context, there's something else as well that's way more important. So let's say in the case of crying, we might have two contexts in which crying has value, but in one of them, crying is the primary thing. In the second context, the crying is there secondarily to serve something else, but it's not the primary thing, because there's something else that's more important in that context. And ultimately, really what this boils down to is our roles in stepping up and taking responsibility in our own lives versus our roles as sources of support and safety and space holding for other people in their challenges. They're both very important, and they're two very different things. It's very common that particularly people who are very intuitive, people who are sensitive, people who are empathetic, very empathetic, that every time they meet someone who's going through a hard time, who's having a hard time, who's struggling with something, when their friend tells them about something, it's very common for people who are very sensitive and empathetic to feel like, oh, what can I do to help them? I need to help solve their problem. What can I do? And that can make for a very overwhelming and stressful life. It can also lead to a lot of feeling of being insufficient, not good enough, because I met all of these people and they have all of these problems and I wasn't able to help any of them. And that can lead to a person feeling like they themselves are not sufficient, are not good enough, when really this wasn't their problem to solve. It's very common, and it's a beautiful thing at some level, when a person who encounters someone else having a struggle naturally feels, oh, I need to help this person solve their problem. And in reality, there is absolutely a time and place to help people as much as we can. But it's very, very important for a whole number of reasons to remember the distinction between a problem that is mine to solve and a problem that is not mine to solve. When a problem is mine to solve, I've got to show up and I've got to do whatever I can to figure out how to get this done. When there's a problem that's someone else's problem to solve, there's, again, obviously time and place for helping people, etc. But if we always take on everyone else's problems as our own, we're going to get overwhelmed. We're very unlikely to cope for very long without, breaking down. We're also probably going to get so consumed by the problems that are not primarily our own that it will take us away from being able to address the problems that are our own problems primarily to address. It's very important to be clear of the distinction that when someone else has a problem, and the thing that is so empowering when we get that clarity and realization and can actually approach it in a way that is ours, that it is our responsibility and our opportunity to approach it correctly, we see how much more powerful it is, even though we're not trying to help. When someone's going through a hard time, when someone's having a struggle, I would say broadly, most of the time, we can't solve people's issues for them. There could be specific things that we can help with and help address, and maybe we could do something to lighten the load. But in general, everybody in life, everybody has a journey. Every journey involves difficulties and challenges and struggles and pain. It's part of, all of those things are once we understand and perceive them for what they are, they're part of the beauty of life, even if they don't feel nice all the time. And if we encounter someone who's having a hard time, who's going through a struggle, who's in pain, chances are, in the overwhelming majority of cases, that person is going to benefit far more from us just being present with them, being there as a source of support, holding space for them so that they feel our support and they can feel that they have the support of another person who's here with them. And that support that we can provide by just being deeply present with them as a source of non-judgmental, just support, not even support's not quite the right word. I would say a more specific way of saying it that I think is more precise is a supportive presence. Supportive presence doesn't mean doesn't necessarily mean, and most of the time it doesn't mean, I'm going to help you fix this. Because a lot of the time it's not our job. And a lot of the time when we try to fix, we end up making things worse rather than better because we're interfering with something, and then it might, feel good for a bit, and then things end up more messed up, and then they have to go. Trying to fix things that are not ours to fix most of the time is not going to be helpful. But just being there with someone, when someone, you ask someone, how's it going? And they're like, are you sure you want to know? And you say yes, and they start telling you, and it's heavy. If we can, in that moment, be deeply present with them, deeply present as a non-judgmental, supportive presence. We're just here, we hear you, we feel your experience, and we are just here as an additional supportive presence. The amount of relief, of support, of strength then that can bring someone is actually shocking. And most of the time, that's what people need. Everybody has challenges and issues, and most of the time, we don't need other people to fix our issues. Our issues are ours to fix. But what we do need, and we all need this, and I think that, that there is a slowly growing grassroots movement of becoming more aware of this. But we all need the support of other people who are deeply present with us, and we need it more than we think. And by more, I mean more often and to a greater degree than we think. We are very social creatures, and social creatures, we're creatures of community. It doesn't just mean we need to have parties to go to, we need people to chat with. It means we need deep human connection. And offering another person deep human connection, it doesn't even have to involve words. Sometimes just being deeply present with your whole body and soul without saying a word, that person, their body, their nervous system will feel that presence. It will feel the presence of the additional body as a source of company, of community, and of support. So Yosef was crying, was expressing grief. Yosef was having, let's say, a primarily empathetic experience about Binyamin's challenge. about Binyamin's pain, about Binyamin's loss. Because Yosef's job, in the context of Binyamin's pain and challenge, was not to fix Binyamin's issue for him. Binyamin's issue is Binyamin's to address. But support and human connection for another person, that is always ours. And so Yosef was there grieving Binyamin's pain, being present with Binyamin in the pain. And the Torah tells us that Yosef cried about Binyamin's loss because Yosef didn't have to get busy fixing. That wasn't his job. But the fact that it was Binyamin's to fix doesn't mean that Yosef didn't have a part to play. If every person who was going through difficulty in life had even just one person who was there for them, who was a source of non-judgmental, supportive presence and connection, humanity would be looking very different. The power, the value of that deep, supportive presence and connection is, I mean, it's priceless. It's unmeasurable. And when we do that for the people we encounter who are having a hard time, it might feel, to someone for whom this is new, it might seem counterintuitive because we're not doing anything to help them. It's true we're not doing anything to help them, but they don't actually need our help. What they need is our support, and we are doing something to support them. We are doing we're giving them the thing that they need from us. Binyamin didn't cry primarily about his loss, his portion. Now, I think when we have to get, obviously, not obviously, but we have to get, I would say, substantially nuanced here. Because we're not saying that a person shouldn't cry about their own difficulties and challenges. It's very, very important, very therapeutic, and very important often for moving forward effectively for a person to express pain, grief, etc., often in the form of crying. And it's a very common thing that, very common. It's a very not uncommon thing. And this is something I think that probably happens a lot more with men today than women because of the, social programming. That someone who's really struggling in life, having a hard time with all kinds of things and, just is really having a difficult time, a difficult go of it. And then for whatever reason, somehow they find themselves just bawling their eyes out, crying in a way that they, maybe someone who hasn't cried for decades, and all of a sudden the floodgates open and it all breaks loose, and they might cry for dozens of minutes, for hours, and then they just, once it starts, it doesn't stop, and it goes and it goes and it goes, and eventually once they get to the other side of that, they find themselves somehow just as a completely different person, and all of a sudden they don't feel stuck the way they were, and they have no idea why. Really, it's quite simple. There was a lot of emotion, of feeling that had been accumulating in their body and piling up for years and years and years and years and years. And every emotion that we feel carries a message and is trying to communicate something. That's the function of emotions. And as all of those messages pile up and pile up and pile up and pile up and pile up, it's like having 10,000 alarm clocks all ringing at the same time. Try doing anything with 10,000 alarm clocks ringing. It's not happening.
Our door at 7:30.
Everyone's alarm. And then we have the 7:45 and the 8.
And then the 8.
Right? So And when this person finally is able to express, to let all of that out, it's like all of the alarm clocks, someone didn't have to come and smash them all. They actually got heard. They got to deliver the message, and they just stopped ringing because the message was delivered. All of a sudden, all of this stuff, all of that crying had been stored inside as alarms ringing. Finally, it was let out, and the person finds themselves as a completely different person. Crying can be very important for moving forward. The difference is that when it comes to moving forward, and I think that I say this, as everybody should speak to their associated healthcare professionals, and this is not medical advice, etc., 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 etc. But I think that there's a very both beautiful and extremely powerful shift that's happening in the world of, let's say, healing/therapy, which is, it's a lot of things, but a big part of this shift is, I think, a shift towards the emphasis being moving forward, healing, rather than looking back. Right? And credit where it's due to Freud, we wouldn't have any of the therapy and healing that we have today without him, because he's the great granddaddy of the whole thing. But at the end of the day, he didn't quite get it right, which is fair enough, right? Things happen in steps and in stages, and the same thing with science, right? The early scientists got everything completely wrong, but the journey that they started was the beginning of the journey that got us here. But the focus back, the emphasis, an approach that emphasizes looking at the problems and then immersing ourselves in problems, can often not necessarily lead to forward movement, as much as an approach that looks at the present, looks at what we need moving forward, and focuses on that. Now, where I'm going with this is, both of these approaches will, let's say, for a person who has years of accumulated, unexpressed negative emotion, grief, sadness, pain, both of these approaches are probably going to involve a lot of crying. The difference is that the first approach is, look at all of these problems and cry about them. The second approach is, what do I need to do to move forward? This is what I need to move forward. To move forward, and let's say somatic approaches will generally built on things like tuning into what we're feeling inside, tuning into what's going into our bodies, and then being curious and inquiring about, what does that mean? What does my body need? What's it asking for? Does it need comfort? Does it need a hug? Does it just need to cry? And then facilitating, supporting the body in whatever it is that it needs to move forward, which might involve crying. The difference is that one approach is, this and this and this problem, all of these things happen, all of these things are so bad, cry. The second approach is, and very often with this forward-oriented somatic approach, a person can cry, have no idea what it is that they're crying about, and it doesn't matter. Because what happened was they tuned into their body, they became aware, and they felt there was this need inside to express something through crying. And the body knows whatever that thing is that's inside that needs to be expressed, the body knows, which is why the person feels the need to cry. The mind doesn't need to know what's the thing I'm crying about. If the mind can let go enough to respect the fact that clearly there is this feeling of a need to express sadness or grief and to cry, and to allow that to be expressed, and then the body expresses that in crying, whether the person knows what they're crying about or not in their head doesn't necessarily matter. Right? The approach here is, and very often what will happen is, in a journey of taking this approach is memories will come up, sensations will come up, and then a person will remember things and become aware of things and what issues were and what happened. But that's not the primary emphasis, right? That's the difference. Is the primary emphasis on the problems, on the challenges, or is the primary emphasis on moving forward? Both of them are going to include probably awareness of challenges, of pain. Both of them are going to include crying. Both of them are going to include feeling negative emotion, feeling discomfort, expressing through tears, rage, whatever it is. But one of them is focusing on the source of pain and crying about that. One of them is focusing on forward movement. And forward movement probably, honestly, for probably almost all people today, forward movement, real, genuine, thriving forward movement in a way that a person is moving forward with everything that they were designed to be, is going to involve, for most people, a lot of learning to feel things that most of us have no idea even how to feel. It's going to involve a lot of expressing. This is where things like breath work can be extremely powerful and beautiful. Both of them include crying. The difference is that when Yosef was looking at Binyamin's issue, that wasn't Yosef's issue to solve. Yosef was there to be empathetic, to feel Binyamin's pain, and to hold space for that. And so the thing that Yosef had to offer for Binyamin's issue was crying, was sharing and feeling the pain with him. When it came to Yosef's issue, Yosef's job is to move forward. It's not Yosef's job. Now, to be fair, and I think this is super important practically, very important. At the end of the day, there are multiple parts of ourselves in us. And learning to do these things for ourselves, learning to hold space for our own feelings can be a truly life-changing skill. When we're feeling something, very often what happens, something happens, a person feels, let's say, angry. When a person is angry, think about what a person, let's take sadness instead. Anger is just a little bit messier. When a person is sad, picture someone who is sad in your mind. You're going to see on their face they look sad, they might be crying. Very often, people who feel sadness inside don't even realize it. They just get dysregulated by it. They get snappy, they get irritable, they start shouting and behaving in ways that they'd rather not behave because there's some sort of negative emotion going on and they're not even aware of what it is consciously. The moment a person stops and says, hang on a second, what's going on inside? What do I feel? What does it feel like inside of me? Where do I feel that? What does it feel like? What's the story, the emotion associated with that sensation in my body? It's like, oh, there's sadness. And then just, when we become aware that there's sadness inside, just be the source of support and connection that's there with the sadness, to allow that sadness to be. The same way that we would do it for another person, we can do it for that part of ourselves inside. And a person who does that can go from being sad to feeling sadness, and they're very different things. A person can carry enormous, deep, heavy sadness inside and still be functional, still be able to experience joy at the same time. If we carry sadness inside, if we feel sadness inside and then we can hold the space for that sadness, we can also feel joy. We can't be sad and be happy at the same time. But we can have them both inside at the same time. And learning this role, learning to do what Yosef did for Binyamin and what Binyamin did for Yosef, for those parts of ourselves. If we stop sometime and say, hang on a second, why am I behaving the way that I'm behaving? What's going on? and slow down and just take a few deep, slow breaths and just really try to tune into what's going on. Oh, I'm feeling... And a very powerful way to do this is to start with the sensation before the emotion. What do I feel in my body? What does it feel like? What's going on? What's the emotion? Oh, I'm feeling frustration about this and this thing that happened. I'm feeling sadness about this and this thing. And then to allow that to be to hold space for that part of ourselves that feels sad, that feels grief, that feels hurt. When someone says something and we, feel hurt by what they said, it can happen all the time, whether the person meant to or not. It's very common that people just go on and they get cranky and the rest of the day is ruined because someone said something that hurt them. There's no need to go around the rest of the day cranky because someone said something that hurt them. That doesn't mean, oh, I don't care, it didn't really hurt me, I'm super tough, because that's not real. But what a person can do is say, oh, you know what? That was really hurtful. And acknowledge the fact that there is pain, that there is hurt, that there is offense that was taken in the person, and then hold space for that part of themselves, that part of ourselves, and acknowledge and allow it to feel hurt, then we can continue being the person who has that part of ourselves inside that feels hurt instead of becoming a hurt person. This is not minimizing the hurt, and the irony is, or the counterintuitive thing is, that when we do this, we'll find that emotions will actually become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger over time. The more that we can hold an emotion inside rather than be the emotion, the bigger they start to get. And they get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. Because for a person who has become their emotion, if that emotion is going to become bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, it's not going to work. But if that emotion, if we can hold it inside of ourselves and still be functional, and still be able to maybe feel joy at the same time as we feel a negative emotion, then what happens is the emotion can get bigger and bigger and it can start to express itself more and more and more and more, and we'll feel emotions getting bigger and bigger and heavier over time, at the same time as we can start to appreciate the beauty in these things because they're part of life, and life is beautiful. Now, when we are, let's say a person is focusing on their own journey forward, that will, because of the complexity of the way that Hashem designed us, that can involve multiple roles. We can be the Yosef for our own Binyamin also, and hold space for parts of ourselves. And that doesn't take away from the fact that at the end of the day, it's our job to make sure that we're moving forward on the things that we are responsible for. And the reality is that a very big part of that, honestly, I suspect for everyone, just some people are more functional without it than others, is being the Yosef for our own Binyamin, the Binyamin for our own Yosef. Being able to also be that source of connection and support for those parts of ourselves inside. But at the end of the day, when it comes to us, no one else can move us forward other than ourselves. Other people can support us in moving forward, but we have to take the steps forward. We have to do the work for ourselves. No one else can do the work for us. That doesn't mean that there isn't a huge impact we can have on someone else's realistic ability to do the work that they have to do by being a source of support, a source of safety, a source of deep human connection. Because that is something that we all need. We need it profoundly. We need it honestly all the time. And so Yosef and Binyamin were that for each other. When it comes to someone else, as desperately as we might want someone else's issues to be solved, and again, there's a time and a place to help, obviously, actively, not just to hold space and to be a source of support and connection. But in general, primarily, other people's issues are not ours to fix. But other people are ours to support. And the more support that people have from the people around them, the more they have a connected, deep, supportive presence, the more empowered they're going to be to do the things they have to do to address their issues. So when it comes to our own issues, it's our job to step forward. We can't wait for other people to fix our problems. But at the same time, the fact that other people can't wait for us to fix their problems doesn't mean that we can't have an enormous impact by being a source of connection and support. So Yosef cried for Binyamin's loss, not for his own. For his loss, he had to focus on helping himself. Now again, helping helping ourselves can often involve crying and holding space, etc. But we're doing that because it's part of us moving forward, not because our primary job is to hold space for ourselves. But when it comes to someone else, that's our job, to be a source of connected support. It's not to fix things. When it comes to ourselves, our job is to move ourselves forward, which realistically does involve those things, and it involves those things, I would say, to probably a much greater degree than most people imagine. But the primary thing that we have to do for ourselves is to move forward, which involves a lot of supporting. When it comes to someone else, our job is not to move them forward, it's just to support them, just to be with them, just being a source of connected, supportive presence, a source of connection and a source of supportive presence for someone can quite literally and realistically change a person's life. Especially if there's someone who doesn't have that at all, and then all of a sudden they have one person who's that source of support, of connection. That not having connection and human support can absolutely be debilitating. It could cause all kinds of clinical illness. We're designed to need it. And that's what our job is to do for the people around us. Support, connection, supportive presence. And that will do more most of the time than trying to fix people's problems for them. And don't feel like we're not doing anything, because that's most of the time the only thing that they actually do need from us.